At 6:40 on a gray Tuesday morning, three HOA board members were standing behind their privacy fence, staring through the chain link at a building they had been dismissing for months. The old brick factory behind their subdivision had been dark, broken, and silent for years. Windows boarded up, loading bays chained shut, weeds pushing through cracked concrete like the ground itself was giving up. They had assumed it would stay exactly that way. They had assumed wrong. Then one morning the gates rolled open. A low diesel rumble shook the back lot first. Then two service trucks appeared. A flatbed hauling structural steel, a mobile welder, a forklift easing a massive engine stand through the side entrance. Fresh safety signs were mounted before sunrise. Yellow striping had been painted across the floor. New bay lights glowed inside that old factory like somebody had reached in and pulled the whole building back from the dead overnight. By the time the HOA president arrived in her SUV, folder in hand, expression already set to shut this down, the smell of cutting oil and hot metal was already drifting across the fence line. She stepped out of her vehicle, stopped cold. County permit tags were zip-tied to the front gate. A licensed contractor was unlocking the main shop doors like he'd done it 100 times before. That was the moment they understood. This wasn't a problem someone had accidentally purchased. This was leverage, space, access. The one property their rules had absolutely no authority over, and the person who bought it had known that from the very first day. That person was me. And this is the full story of how a dead factory behind a polished HOA subdivision became the best business decision I ever made, and why the people who tried to stop it actually helped build it. My name is Cole, and I did not stumble into this. I spent 12 years building and maintaining diesel fleets for other companies, fixing breakdowns at midnight, keeping trucks rolling through storms, harvest seasons, and construction deadlines, while the people who owned those trucks made fortunes off equipment they barely understood and rarely respected. After a while, I stopped wanting another raise. I wanted a base of my own, a place where I could build something that answered to my work ethic and nobody else's opinion. The factory had been sitting on the back edge of a polished HOA development where every mailbox matched, every lawn looked like a staging photo, and every board member conducted themselves as though property lines gave them authority over the entire visible horizon. Most people who drove past that building saw a dead structure, a liability, an eyesore waiting for somebody else to deal with. I saw a reinforced concrete shell with oversized bay access, industrial power infrastructure, genuine truck turnaround room, and one advantage that most commercial real estate in the area couldn't offer. It was already physically separated from the neighborhood by existing fencing, a drainage strip, and an old service road that predated the subdivision entirely. The bones of that building were heavy, square, and built for serious work, not appearances. In my line of business, that distinction matters more than fresh paint ever will. The best part was that nobody credible wanted it. Developers thought it was too ugly. Retail investors thought it was too far from the highway. The HOA crowd had decided it was an eyesore and assumed whoever eventually bought it would either tear it down or leave it exactly as it was. I did neither. I bought it because the county records showed something most people had never bothered to check. That parcel carried an older industrial use history, direct utility access, and legal entry routes that the subdivision had no authority to block, regardless of how they felt about noise, steel, or diesel smoke. The day I signed those closing papers, I wasn't purchasing a problem. I was purchasing a future they were going to absolutely hate. The HOA didn't introduce themselves like neighbors. They introduced themselves like supervisors who had apparently decided that the view behind their homes belonged to them, whether or not the actual property did. Their president, I'll call her Elaine, had a polished voice, always wore the right jacket, and carried the kind of smile that only showed up when she believed she was about to corner someone with paperwork. She usually had two board members with her who nodded before she finished sentences, as if pre-agreement was written into the bylaws somewhere. I met them 3 days after closing. They were already waiting at the chain-link gate when I arrived with a locksmith and a roofing contractor. Elaine held her folder against her chest and asked whether I planned to address the visual situation before beginning any real work. I asked what that meant. She glanced at the building and said the residents had no interest in living behind a noisy industrial site, especially one that might attract trucks, mechanics, fuel smells, and, quote, that type of activity. That phrase told me exactly what I needed to know. She wasn't asking what I planned to do. She was measuring how easily I could be pushed. I kept the conversation short. I told her I had purchased the parcel legally, I was securing the structure, and any future use would follow county requirements, not neighborhood preferences. Her smile returned, but it looked strained this time. She said the board would be reviewing all available options and suggested I think carefully before investing heavily in something that might become difficult to operate. That was their opening move. Not a threat direct enough to challenge, just vague enough to unsettle someone who wasn't paying attention. But people who operate the way Elaine did make the same mistake on repeat. They confuse confidence with control. And once they believe fear will do the work for them, they start overplaying their hand long before the real game begins. Over the next 3 weeks, the letters started arriving. One claimed I was creating a future nuisance before a single piece of equipment had been installed. Another warned that heavy vehicle traffic could reduce surrounding property values. A third questioned my right to use the service road, a road that had existed longer than half the subdivision it was supposedly threatening. Every message was written in the same polished, careful tone, designed to sound official while carrying no actual legal weight whatsoever. I answered none of them emotionally. Instead, I started building a file. Every notice went into a binder. Every conversation got logged with date, time, and exact words. When Elaine cornered me outside the gate to say the neighborhood would not tolerate an industrial eyesore coming back to life, I wrote it down before my truck door had even closed. When a board member parked near the entrance and started taking photographs through the fence, I saved the security footage. When someone placed orange cones across the service road one morning, trying to make my contractors turn around, I photographed the obstruction, removed it, and had the images in front of the county access office before lunch. That was their first expensive mistake. The second came when they started filing complaints they didn't fully understand. Elaine filed noise complaints before there were any noise-making operations inside the building. She requested inspection reviews on fuel storage before a single tank had been installed. She pushed the county zoning desk to question my renovation plans, apparently assuming the parcel would be treated like a fresh commercial application rather than what it actually was. An older industrial site with continuing use protections built into its history. Every time she pushed, she created a paper trail. And every time the county responded, the truth moved a little more clearly into my corner. Meanwhile, I stayed focused on work they had no power to interrupt. Roof crews replaced damaged panels. Electricians tested old conduit runs. Concrete contractors repaired the cracked loading apron. I kept permits posted, inspections scheduled, and every contractor properly licensed. I gave them nothing reckless to attack. And that made Elaine more dangerous, not less, because people who fail quietly tend to escalate loudly. By the end of that first month, the board wasn't trying to scare me off anymore. They were trying to manufacture enough confusion, delay, and pressure to make the project bleed money before it ever opened. What they still hadn't grasped was something simple. I had already planned for resistance. And the more aggressively they pushed, the more evidence they were handing me for the fight that was coming. The turning point came on a Thursday afternoon in the county records office. The clerk handed me a packet thick enough to explain everything, why the HOA had been acting so confident, and exactly why that confidence was built on assumptions that didn't hold up. Buried in the parcel history were use maps, archived permits, and a classification trail showing the factory had never fully lost its industrial standing. It had gone inactive. It had not gone extinct. That distinction changed everything. Most people assume an empty property resets itself if it sits long enough. It doesn't, not always. In this case, the site still carried older utility designations, freight access notes, and a grandfathered operating profile tied to prior mechanical and agricultural equipment work. The county planner walked me through it line by line. As long as I stayed within code, completed the required safety upgrades, and operated within the approved use envelope, the HOA could complain every single day and still have zero authority to shut me down. That alone was solid ground. But there was more. The service road Elaine kept hinting could be restricted was protected through recorded access language tied to the parcel long before the subdivision ever existed. The drainage strip between the fence and the lot line, the one the board treated like their private buffer zone, wasn't theirs either. And the biggest surprise was sitting in the utility files. The site had been built for heavier electrical demand than I had even projected, which meant converting the building into a full diesel garage wasn't just possible, it was unusually practical. The infrastructure was already there, waiting. I left that office with copies, stamped maps, recorded documents, and the calmest headspace I'd been in since closing day. Because once you know the ground under you is actually solid, pressure stops feeling like danger. It starts feeling like a countdown. I stopped running the project like a renovation and started running it like an opening. That shift mattered in ways you could see and measure. Repairs became timelines. Timelines became deliveries. Deliveries became proof. Within 10 days, the factory no longer looked abandoned. It looked claimed. We cleared the office wing first, then the main floor. Rotten shelving came out. Broken partitions came down. Old machine anchors were cut flush with the concrete. The floor was cleaned, patched, and sealed. New LED baylights went up in rows, bright enough to expose every stain the building had collected over the previous decade. By the second week, 2 heavy truck lifts were installed. A fabrication corner was framed out. Compressed air lines were routed. A parts cage went up beside the rear wall. Then the outside changed. Gravel dressed the side lot. Fresh striping marked the equipment lanes, and a legal signboard went up displaying the business name, permit numbers, and contractor information in plain view from the fence. Every improvement was deliberate. I wanted no mystery, no ambiguity, and no soft spots to attack. If the HOA looked over that fence, and they did, constantly, I wanted them seeing exactly what the county saw: compliance, investment, and momentum that wasn't slowing down. That was when the panic started showing. Elaine drove past twice in a single day, then 3 times the next. One board member stood at the fence pretending to be on a phone call while watching a rollback unload a disabled fleet truck into Bay 2. Another photographed the new sign like he expected the lettering itself to be a violation. But there was nothing hidden to attack. The fire inspection passed. Electrical sign-off cleared. Access remained open. Contractors kept moving. And then the sound changed everything. Impact guns, air tools, diesel engines at idle, steel on steel. Not chaos, work. Real, sustained, professional work. The kind of sound that tells everyone in earshot that something permanent is happening, and it is not going to stop. By the end of that week, the old factory behind their neighborhood had a new identity. It was no longer an eyesore they could point at and complain about. It was a fully operational diesel garage, legally alive, commercially useful, and getting louder with every hour they failed to stop it. Elaine made her final move on a Monday morning. At 8:15, a courier handed me a cease and desist packet. It claimed my operation threatened residential peace, exceeded acceptable use, and should be halted pending emergency county review. The language looked expensive. The timing looked coordinated. By noon, the HOA had circulated word through the neighborhood that county officials were finally stepping in. They wanted residents believing the garage was finished before it had even fully opened. What they didn't know was that the county had already seen everything I had. When I walked into the review meeting 2 days later, I brought a contractor folder, inspection sign-offs, parcel maps, recorded access documents, utility confirmations, and the entire industrial use file that a month of Elaine's complaints had accidentally done more to strengthen than anything I could have submitted on my own.
She arrived with a board attorney, two visibly nervous members, and the same confident expression she always wore right before facts dismantled it. The county planner spoke first, then zoning, then fire compliance. One by one, every issue the HOA had raised got answered with documents already on record and confirmed by county staff in real time. Access was valid. Use history was protected. Safety upgrades were complete and verified. Traffic concerns were speculative with nothing measurable to support them. Noise claims had no code violation attached. Even the service road argument collapsed the moment the recorded easement language was read aloud in that room. You could feel the air leave their side of the table. Elaine tried one last angle, arguing that the garage was fundamentally incompatible with the surrounding community character. The planner shut that down in a single sentence. Community preference was not legal authority over a separately governed parcel. That was it. That was the moment the fight ended. Not with a shout, not with a dramatic confrontation, with silence. The particular, heavy silence of people who came in expecting to win and just watched every argument they had dissolve in front of the people it mattered most to impress. The emergency review request was denied. The cease and desist had no teeth. And the same board that had spent months trying to bury the project had just sat in a county meeting room and watched it get publicly confirmed as fully permitted, fully legal, and fully operational. On record, in front of everyone. 3 months after that meeting, the old factory behind the subdivision looked like neither the problem it had been, nor the argument it had temporarily become. It looked successful. Diesel pickups lined the side lot before sunrise. Fleet accounts dropped off service orders every week. Owner-operators came in for diagnostics, injectors, brakes, wiring, and full rebuild work. The bays stayed full. The lights stayed on. The doors kept opening, and the fence never stopped being there. That same fence they had stood behind thinking it gave them something. That part always made me smile, because on the other side of it sat the same people who had called that building an eyesore, a threat, a mistake, and a fight they could win. Now they heard the clean, consistent rhythm of a business they couldn't block, couldn't vote against, and couldn't shame into disappearing. They wanted silence. What they got was proof that useful work doesn't need anyone's approval to matter. I didn't buy that factory to make a point. I bought it to build something durable and real, something that could stand on its own merits through whatever pressure came at it. The point assembled itself, and every time another diesel truck rolls through those gates and the bay lights come on and the tools start up, it reinforces one simple truth that was always there. I was never the one trapped by that fence. They were. Here's what I want you to take from this beyond the story itself. The HOA had social pressure, legal-sounding letters, and the assumption that uncertainty would do their work for them. What they didn't have was the actual ground. They had never checked the records. They had never verified whether their confidence had any foundation under it. They just assumed it did. And they moved on that assumption right up until the moment the facts walked into the room and sat down across from them. Know your ground. Read the documents. Build the file. Do the work. And let the people who are betting on your confusion learn the hard way that they've been counting cards in a game where you already know the deck. If this one hit differently, if you've dealt with overreach, boundary testing, or someone who confused volume for authority, drop your story in the comments. And if you want more of this, subscribe and stick around. There's always another story worth telling, and the next one is right around the corner.